Alright, so you've decided that you want to get better at programming. And of course, by going onto the internet, there's a million resources from a million creators, and there's so many different ways that you can go learn about programming. So whether you're checking out blog articles, you're watching videos on YouTube just like this one, you're scrolling through social media trying to pick up all the little tidbits that you can about different programming languages, different ways to approach it, there is so much for you to consume, so much knowledge, so much information. Where do you start? It's totally normal as humans that we look for shortcuts when it comes to learning things. Given that information is so readily available at our fingertips, you would think that if we just look hard enough, we should be able to find that shortcut. Someone's published it somewhere, right? There's gotta be a trick to it. There's gotta be something we can do to get us to the finish line faster. Now, there's a lot of people promising things like courses or boot camps that are, you pay X amount of dollars and in 2 or 3 weeks or something like that, you're gonna be an expert programmer. But it's just nonsense. And when I say nonsense, I don't mean that there aren't valuable courses or that boot camps can't work for you. I just mean that you're not going to achieve mastery in a matter of weeks. Something that I continuously preach in a lot of my videos or social media content is that if you want to achieve mastery in programming, the shortcut is accepting that there is no shortcut. You need to be practicing what you're learning. So recently on social media, in particular on Instagram, I had someone asking me about how to actually go about practicing things and balancing that with learning. So in this video, I wanted to discuss the balance between trying to actually go create things versus absorbing information from videos like this one, articles, or other sources of information on the internet. The other thing that I'm going to address is how much upfront learning you should be trying to do before jumping into a project or trying to code something from scratch. Okay, so to start, before we jump into it, I just want to say that yes, there are tons of resources, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and I do think that for many people, lots of these different resources can be effective. So although you might see me posting things like, boot camps aren't the solution, I'm not trying to suggest that a boot camp might not be valuable for you, but I am trying to suggest that you're not going to achieve mastery just from that thing in 1 or 2 weeks. I do recommend that you try watching videos like this one or from other creators, that you do try reading blog articles and learning about different concepts, that you do poke around on Stack Overflow. You could go reading things on GitHub, going through people's code bases and trying to understand what's going on. All of these things are valuable. They are resources where you can learn from, and I do think that you should go do those things. But my main driver when I talk about you should be building things, you should be trying to apply that knowledge and coding things, my point is that the information that you're trying to gather from these sources, I think the only way that it really sticks is when you actually apply it and practice it over and over. So hopefully that clears things up, because I don't want people coming after me saying, hey, this was a really good boot camp, why do you say they're all bad? I'm not saying that, I just don't think that the mastery part comes super quick. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start with how much should you be trying to learn upfront before you jump into creating your own project, and what might that project look like? Well, I would actually suggest that you start coding things right away, and that might look like going through a very simple beginner tutorial for how to set up your environment to actually code. So on my channel, I talk a lot about C#. It's the language that I prefer to use. It's not the only language I know, it's just the one that I'm most comfortable with. So when you're watching my videos, you'll see me using Visual Studio a lot, sometimes Visual Studio Code, but mostly Visual Studio. But depending on what language you plan to learn, there might be a different integrated developer environment, also called an IDE, and getting set up so that you can start coding and running your code or compiling your code. That's something that when you're following some of these tutorials, they'll often have a very simple program like a hello world. And if you're very new to programming, a hello world program is usually the first program you ever end up writing. It really just prints something out to the console that says hello world. So my recommendation is really that when you start with some of these and you start building on top of that, so you might start with your hello world program, and then maybe you're learning about different data structures or different variable types in the language you're using. So for example, maybe how do you create an array and store values in the array? I would say if you're reading an article on that or watching a video, I would highly recommend you pull up your integrated developer environment, your IDE, whether that's Visual Studio or something else, and you try writing a little program that can actually put values into the array, take values back out of the array, and just work with arrays based on the content you're learning. And honestly, in the beginning, you should be starting with really simple things, right? So I wouldn't expect that your first program is creating some, huge monolithic ASP.NET Core web service that's able to scale to, serve hundreds of thousands of users, and then you split that into microservices, or nothing like that should be an expectation when you start programming. And that's totally okay, because my first program, or one of my first programs, was actually making a WinForms application where the screen actually just flashed different colors. Your first programs will be very simple. So I do recommend that you start following some really simple tutorials trying to teach you about the different things in the language, and that you start applying those into programs that don't actually serve a real purpose. They just let you actually apply some of the concepts you're learning. Now, what's really cool from there, and what I'll link in the end of this video, is that there's a bunch of little projects that you can start building once you have some of that foundation. So if you stay right to the end of this, I will link my next video, which will start covering some of these projects that you could start to explore. And again, don't be worried if you go look at that list and you're like, I have no idea how I'm going to make this. That's okay, because the approach that you're going to want to take is that when you look at a list of projects like that, you start breaking down what that entire project looks like, and you see if you can start building little pieces of it. And when you start building the little pieces, you'll find over time that you're practicing, and you'll find over time that you'll have ways to integrate those pieces into something bigger. And honestly, that's how a lot of programs come together. So to recap on that first question, how much should you be learning up front before you start programming? I would say very little up front, and start applying that information right away. The next question we want to look at is, how do we balance that, collection of information from the internet, whether that's videos, articles, anything else? How do we balance that with actually going to apply that by building things? And I think for a lot of people, this answer is going to change an awful lot. So I don't want to be prescriptive in what I'm about to say. I want to try and generalize it so that you can have a framework to work with. But I do think that there is a balance between trying to learn new concepts and apply them versus actually creating something like production software. And I just want to give you an example from my own experience so that you can kind of think through this, and we'll try and dissect it a little bit. But when I'm creating hobby projects, and these are things that I don't really intend to release to the public, and if I do, they're going to be something where it's just, a learning exercise. When I compare that to something where I might want to monetize it, or I'm building it for work and there's paying customers and things like that, the projects that are more hobby related, what I generally try to do is pick something that I want to go learn. So it might be one or two things that I might say, just to give you an example, like I want to go learn about MongoDB. I'm not familiar with it. I'd like to learn it. So I want to build something with a database, and I want it to be a document store. So I'll use MongoDB. And then I might pick some other technology as well and say, I'm going to try this out in my application. But the rest of the application, I will generally try and pick familiar technologies. So that might be, I might create the architecture and the layout of the code for that application in a similar way. I'd probably stick with something like C# so that I can have a basis for what I'm trying to build, and then focus on learning these other things added onto it, right? So in this example, maybe something like MongoDB, and I'm using MongoDB from C#. When it comes to production software or things for work, I try to stick to what I know. And no, that doesn't mean that if I'm working in a team and someone suggests something that I'm not familiar with, that I shut it down right away. It's just that I try to pick things I'm familiar with so that I can iterate quickly. When it comes to business and paying customers, time is of the essence, because you need to be able to deliver things and value to the customer so that they can try it out, so that you can iterate based on that feedback and have that loop so that you can keep offering more value based on what customers are saying. If I were to take more time just to go and experiment and play with different technologies, the customers aren't getting value while I'm learning about these different things. Of course, there's going to be scenarios where I do have to learn, on the job, because maybe it's a different, domain that I'm not familiar with. I have to use a new technology I'm not familiar with. That happens all the time. But for the things that I can control, I want to try and pick things that allow me to iterate quickly. So if we contrast my hobby projects with something that is more production ready, I'm trying to build software for customers, how do I balance my time? Well, that really just depends on my own workload at this point. So I do try to make sure that I'm always trying to learn little things or different technologies that I'm hearing about so that I can try and stay up to date. But at different points in time, I have more or less projects that I need to work on that I would consider like for production. Now, for you, if you're watching this and you're just getting started out, I would probably say you don't have anything to deliver to customers. In fact, if you're trying to ship things to customers and you're not actually familiar with how to program, that's going to be a lot of pressure, and you're probably not going to have a great amount of success delivering on that software. And that's okay, because you want to build up some experience first. So in the beginning, you probably want to focus almost all of your efforts on, like I said earlier, trying to take information from different sources and apply it with really simple programs. And then over time, as you're building that expertise up, then you might start getting comfortable and saying, okay, I can put together a whole application that has some functionality. If you're in a position where you think that you have customers, and when I say customers, I don't necessarily mean they have to be paying. It could be that you want to offer up a cool website that people can interact with, or a little tool that you're releasing for free, whatever it happens to be. In that situation, you have like customers, right? Paying or not. And if you're already kind of going down that path, you're going to want to consider how much time you're putting into that versus how much you're learning on the side. And this is why I was saying I can't prescribe anything, because everyone's scenario is going to be different. But for me, I do like making sure that I can be learning something all of the time, and that will be on the side from my actual production-ready software that I'm trying to create. So just to recap, I do think that it's really valuable to go learn information from lots of the different sources you have available to you. So videos like this one, blog posts, boot camps if you're into that kind of thing, courses online. There's lots of sources of information that can teach you about programming. Next, I do think that it's really important that you go applying that information and building things. And like I said, I don't think you need to wait very long. I think as soon as you start to learn something, try applying it in really, really simple programs. And they don't really have to have a purpose aside from you trying to apply what you're learning. And finally, when it comes to balancing like how much we're learning versus delivering things, that's going to be very different for everyone. But I do recommend for everyone that you try always trying to learn about something so that you can keep up to date. And then when you come across new challenges, at least you might have heard of some of the technologies or be familiar with them. And that way, even if you're not an expert or you've never actually applied it before, it might be familiar enough where you can go start researching it. And now that you've built up some of the other expertise from practicing the other stuff, introducing one new thing isn't so hard. So when my next video is done, I will link it right up here, and you can watch that next for different projects that you can try out. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.